to facilitate this discussion of three really incredible researchers, all of whom have kind of done taken a slightly different take on this issue. So I want to introduce, first of all, Kate Weisberg, who's an associate professor of law at George Washington University, and she previously directed the Youth Defender Clinic at the East Bay Community Law Center at UC Berkeley School of Law. I mean, Kate's been working with us for many years, back since the days of 2015, when we were kind of voices in the wilderness saying how horrible this technology was, but we've come a long way, and she's done a great report, her and her team. So we'll get to that research in a minute. And then we have Julie Mao, who's the Deputy Director of Just Futures Law, and previously she was a senior attorney at the National Immigration Project at the National Lawyers Guild, and an attorney at the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. And she's been part of a whole team and a conglomeration of organizations that have put together a battery of reports, which are really fantastic and varied in their findings and implications. And then finally, we have Puck Lowe. They're a researcher for Community Justice Exchange, a national organization that supports organizers working against all forms of incarceration and social control. They're based in New York City, and they've also done some very interesting video work on electronic monitoring. So I'm hoping just to have a discussion with each of the researchers about what the projects they've been involved in, and kind of what the implications and the importance of what they've done is. So I'm going to begin with Kate. You and your team of students and interns from GWU have very recently, within a couple of weeks, have published a report called Electronic Prisons, the operation of ankle monitoring in the criminal legal system. It's a vast report, so probably the most extensive study we've seen, certainly, of the policies of electronic monitoring. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the scope of what you did, how you did it, and the most important findings from your research. Thanks, Kate.
Well, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for the invitation to join you all today. This research project is very much inspired by and supported by so many people on this call. And so it's really nice to be in conversation with you all. In a nutshell, this report exposes the inner workings, the sort of architecture and infrastructure of electronic surveillance of people on pretrial release, probation, and parole throughout the United States. While we know a fair amount about the operations of prisons, about the operations of probation, we don't have that same detailed knowledge of the operations of electronic surveillance, and that's what this report we hoped to address with this report. So I'll briefly explain what we did, what we found, and what we think these findings may mean. So what we did, over the course of 2 years, a team of law students and I collected 247 agency records from 101 agencies in 44 states, plus the District of Columbia. These were all government agencies responsible for overseeing pretrial release, probation, and parole. The records we collected, there were sort of 3 buckets of records. We collected the terms and conditions that people have to follow who are on monitors. That includes the terms and conditions specific to the monitoring program, as well as the terms and conditions of general release, because as so many of you know on this call, people are often subject to both sets of rules, not one or the other. We also requested and reviewed internal agency policies governing the use of electronic surveillance. And finally, we also collected the contracts between the private surveillance vendors and the public agencies. We then reviewed and hand-coded these records, specifically looking at how the rules impacted key aspects of life, including personal autonomy, travel, privacy, family and social relationships, employment, housing, and financial security. We wanted to know how these rules impacted these key aspects of daily life. So the key findings, let me briefly describe what we found. I think our report offers further evidence of what advocates, impacted people, and activists have long been saying, which is that electronic monitoring, with its own elaborate web of restrictions, rules, and deprivations, is a form of incarceration that occurs outside of traditional prison walls. The analysis of these agency records demonstrates that the experience of being incarcerated is not limited to brick and mortar prisons. By every measure, the rules governing electronic surveillance undermined people's abilities to succeed outside of prison walls. So what we found when we reviewed these rules, we found that the rules undermine autonomy because people are imprisoned in their homes. Almost every agency that we studied uses EM in conjunction with house arrest. So people cannot leave their home without permission, and that permission is often difficult to obtain. I'll just give you one example. Our report is filled with examples. So I urge you to check out the examples. We will make the records will be publicly available, and I'm happy to share these records, the underlying records, with anyone who would like to see them. But there are some pretty stark examples in the records we were reviewing. For example, and this is just one example.
Sorry, could you just speak a little bit slower, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
I apologize. Thank you. So in Johnson County, Kentucky, for example, the rules state, quote, while on home incarceration, you are required to remain inside of your residence at all times, except for the times you are scheduled to be out. Inside means no decks, patios, porches, taking out the trash, etc. That is just one of many examples. People on monitors also have virtually no privacy. In every jurisdiction in our study, location data is tracked, analyzed, and stored 24/7. None of the agency records that we looked at, for the most part, there are a few exceptions, provided protections for this data or whom the data could be shared with. This data is always shared with the court and with probation, and oftentimes also with law enforcement. And the privacy is not limited to location data. Many agencies in our study also use devices equipped with microphones and speakers, as you just saw in the video that we watched. Our study also revealed the nature and number of rules and restrictions imposed on people wearing monitors. Rules often included incredibly vague prohibitions on not associating with people who, quote unquote, have disreputable character, who have criminal records, and the list goes on. There are limits on where you can live, who you can live with, who you can socialize. And as the quiz demonstrated, in at least 2 places, there are prohibitions on marrying without permission. In terms of setting people up to fail, in many respects, these rules prove that this is the perfect storm. You combine the number of rules with the vagueness of the rules and the monitoring capabilities of the devices. And the result is that there is the perfect detection of inevitable imperfections with the rules. Finally, the study also further established the wealth extracting nature of surveillance, as well as the huge influence of private surveillance companies. We only sort of scratched the surface of analyzing these contracts, these multi-million-dollar contracts. We have dozens of them in our study. I do welcome anyone who wants to look at them and wants to be a thought partner in how to analyze those. But as many of you know on this call, it costs people on monitors sometimes thousands of dollars to be on a monitor for a year. So let me just conclude with 4 takeaways that I think that we took from working on this study. First, as a descriptive matter, the restrictions and deprivations associated with monitoring mirror the restrictiveness of prison. The difference in restriction between monitoring and prison is really a matter of degree, not of kind. Second, in some ways, these rules demonstrate that it's even more precarious to be on a monitor than to be in incarceration. The fees, the potential for violations, the unpredictability, the web of rules makes life on a monitor uniquely perilous. The third point is that although this report focused on ankle monitors, it's pretty clear that ankle monitors are not, the restrictions are not limited to ankle monitors. Apps on cell phones, other forms of technological restraint and surveillance are quickly replacing the ankle monitor, but I think our findings will apply to those types of technologies as well. Although our report was focused on ankle monitors and most of the written policies still pertain to ankle monitors. Finally, I think this report highlights some key questions that I look forward and we've been talking about, and I look forward to talking with you all about, such as how do we push back against monitoring? What changes can limit the use of monitoring? What are some reform efforts that won't undermine abolitionist efforts to eliminate the use of surveillance? Could we have simplified rules, custody or good time credit, privacy protections, limits on the length of time someone can be on a monitor, the elimination of detention and incarceration for certain rule violations? These are all questions that I think are hard questions that I look forward to engaging with you all on. I'm happy to share the records, like I said, with anyone. We will be putting them in a Dropbox, so they are accessible. And I look forward to talking offline with more folks if you're interested in learning more.
Thanks so much, Kate. I just had such a pleasure reading that report after seeing we've been sort of starving for information, for data on electronic monitoring, and then seeing both the comprehensiveness of this report, the amount of data that you managed to unearth, but then I think also it's very readable and accessible. So unlike a lot of academic research, I think this is research that is made for people to use. And I'm hoping that people on this call, we've put the link to the report in the chat, but I hope people will have a look at it and see how it might inform their work. So we're going to now move across to Julie Mao. Julie, Just Futures Law, in partnership with Mi Gente and a number of other organizations, has produced a plethora of reports on electronic monitoring and carceral technology more broadly, well beyond ankle monitors and apps. So I know this is a big mountain to climb in a very short amount of time, but if you could at least give us a brief glimpse of the reports that you and your team and your partners have put together, and what are some of the key findings there? Just amaze us in this little bit of time with all the stuff you found.
Thanks so much, James, and thank you and all the crew at MediaJustice for inviting us. Like I'm representing multiple hats here, us, Mi Gente, No Tech for ICE campaign, and our wonderful Take Back Tech fellow, Ali Pandwani, to this space to talk about this. I will also give props to the presenters for having the same white background. It feels like we're in the same space. Good job. And yes, I will try to do sort of an overview of this No Tech for ICE work that Mi Gente has led now for a number of years, why we decided to do this report on digital prisons, and some of the key intervention places that we think might be helpful as we're learning a lot more about this e-carceration space. So super quickly, who am I? Work currently at Just Futures Law. We're a movement lawyering shop that does anti-deportation work and really challenging the growth of surveillance that is now, frankly, largely driving immigration enforcement. And so today we're going to be lifting up this report, really led by our fellow Ali, and then repping Jacinto Gonzalez and Mi Gente, who couldn't be here today. So just super quick context around why we're doing this work. I think the backdrop of this digital prisons report is that we've been engaging in a multi-year investigation, a series of reports around how ICE, in collaboration with local policing, is relying on surveillance and technology to build algorithms, sell and buy data, and supply ankle shackles, facial recognition, verification apps to carry out more and more detention and deportation at a huge scale. So this initially led to this launch of the No Tech for ICE campaign as a way to intervene on technology companies. We're going to be talking about GEO, BI incorporated in our context today, but big companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, who are all really making millions of dollars, billions of dollars at this point off the backs of immigrants and BIPOC communities in order to build ICE's deportation machine. We think that this sort of tech surveillance arm of ICE.
Hi, Julie. Sorry, could you just speak slower, please, and just mind your pace?
Yep.
I was gonna pause. I was gonna interrupt you when you said quickly, but take your time. It's all good.
Okay.
Thank you so much again. And since I'm already interrupting, just let us know, just say next slide when you need us to go to the next slide.
Okay.
Cool. Thank
you.
you.
Apologies. I was trying to speed it up just so folks had a little bit more time on the back end, but I'll try to cut stuff. So I think the thing to understand from our perspective is we feel that with the new administration and the gross criminalization that's happening at primarily the southwest border, surveillance is going to be way more expansive and aggressive under the Biden administration. And we think that's going to happen in two ways. Tech surveillance that's related to locating individuals here in the United States, as well as the expansion of alternatives, so-called alternatives to detention. So we're talking, the ankle shackles that Kate was talking about. And in our sector, unfortunately, also the expansion of facial recognition verification and location services monitoring. We think on the alternatives to detention, SmartLink and ICE side, the key interventions coming forth are going to be around investor advocacy when it relates to GEO and BI, who are getting billion-dollar contracts to do this type of rollout of invasive surveillance-based alternatives. And then we also think the intervention is going to be case-by-case fights, working with community members to take ankle monitors and SmartLink and de-escalate their cases so they no longer have to be part of this program. And lastly, there's a huge, we're gonna go start these slides. There's a huge money component to this from Congress. The only reason why what we call the ISAP Alternatives to Detention Program exists is because Congress appropriates around $450 or now around $470 million per year to fund this program, and that actually could be stopped, especially, supposedly with this Congress and the party being what it is. Those numbers can go drastically down. And so we also see that as an intervention opportunity. So with that, I'm gonna start kind of doing the slides and quickly giving you guys a sense of the numbers. So if you can move to the next slide. Awesome. So I mentioned the numbers already, but basically ICE's budget right now for this so-called Alternatives to Detention program, they term it ISAP, which is an acronym for the Intensive Supervision Appearances Program. So this program has drastically increased since 2006. You can see the numbers. It started around 28 million. It is now in 2021, $440 million. I can say as an immigration attorney who has practiced for now about 10 to 13 years, when I first started, very few people were actually on ankle monitors. It was a rare occurrence. Now, just from talking to the ICE San Antonio office the other day, he was telling me that basically everybody is being put on either ankle monitor or SmartLink from the border if they're not detained. So it is now the norm for people to either be on an ankle monitor or the SmartLink application, what we'll talk about at this time. And even though ICE has said this is an alternative to detention, we've also seen the simultaneous drastic increase in detention for immigrants from 1 billion to 2.8 billion. Even though Biden initially promised in his campaign that he would be more humane around immigration enforcement, we've seen a drastic, aggressive increase in funding requests from the Biden administration. The numbers under Trump were already gross. They were hovering around 80 to 90,000 individuals at any given time on their intensive supervision appearance program. Biden administration is hoping to increase those numbers to 140,000 individuals. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so here are some current numbers. Before January, again, under the Trump administration, we were hovering around 96,000 individuals under the ISAP program. As of, I think, a month or two ago, these stats are actually a little bit outdated. We were already seeing an increase to 117,000 individuals. The time on which people are on these ankle monitors or SmartLink is fairly long. We're talking, 2, bordering on 3 years. We did see a slight decrease in the average number, still 703 days. And I think that is due possibly to the amount of new people that are now in the ankle, in the alternatives to detention program. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is just a quick slide on where we're seeing the most amount of individuals in the ISAP program. I'll just quickly name some of the highest places we're seeing are Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami, Newark, San Antonio, and San Francisco. And these are stats as of July 2021. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. So this is a slide around the percentage of increase of individuals enrolled in this ISAP program between May and August of this year. And so you'll see almost every field office experienced significant increases in its ISAP program. Next slide, please. Okay, so we want to shift a little bit to talk about the new rollout of the ICE SmartLink, I say smart in quotes, application. So this is a mobile application that individuals in the ISAP program are forced to download onto their phones, and it has the capabilities of requesting location data, requires facial recognition verification, and then also has the capability of requiring voice verification. Next slide, please. So again, this program is called SmartLink. Next slide. And this is a visual display of what the application looks like when you click into it. I know from all the work of the membership that SmartLink is also an application that happens in the criminal justice or criminal legal system side. So I think that you guys are seeing something similar, but basically it contains a lot of your information. It has your check-ins, you import certain types of information, and then at your check-in, you're supposed to click take photo, and does a visual facial verification as well as requesting your location at that time. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the recent numbers around what type of supervision people are on in ISAP. So These are the numbers for June 2019 and May 2021. And the point we're trying to make is that there's been a drastic increase in individuals who are being put on this SmartLink mobile application. And we expect that this is, the technology that ICE is driving towards in the future, is to take people off of ankle monitor or keep the same amount of people on ankle monitors, but then increasingly put everyone or as many people as they can on this mobile verification application. Next slide, please. There's another slide to demonstrate where things are and where we expect them to be. As of August 2021, 46% of all individuals on ISAP are on the SmartLink application. Next, please. So I'm a little out of time, and I'm happy to share these slides, but this slide is basically to show, again, the real increase now in the SmartLink use. We're seeing, 200 to 100% increases in the use of this mobile application for ISAP. Next slide. Okay, so I think one of the concerns that we have with the SmartLink device is that even though ICE has said that it's not collecting location or voice related data when it's not during the check-in process, we know from even the exact permissions on the mobile application and the agreement that individuals have to sign that the application collects far more data than ICE is saying to individuals. And so for technologists out there, you kind of already know this, but the language itself says that they will collect information about the mobile device, the IP address, the unique device identifier. Next slide.
Thanks, Julia. Just want to give you a time warning. Sorry to do that.
Yep. No worries. So I'll just end it there. I think the last thing we'll say, I think this is similar to the criminal side, is that BI Total Access is the interface that the ICE agents use to track individuals. And so even though individuals have been told by ICE that they don't track their real-time location, we do know that ICE has access to this backend application. And so is able to look at the historical trail of individuals who are on ankle shackles and likely individuals who are on SmartLink. So I'll leave it at that and share the slides, I'm sure, in the follow-up. Thanks so much, James.
Thank you so much, Julie. That's amazing. I mean, this is really the kind of the cutting edge of this technology, and it's kind of hasn't really been fully recognized, but I think the work that you, along with Mi Gente and other organizations, have done are really shining a light on this, and hopefully we can mobilize even more resistance to the to the companies and the electeds that are driving this process. So we're going to move now to Puck Lowe. Puck, your work has a slightly different framing than most EM research. I mean, you're trying to move away from some of the terminology of location tracking and exploring how these technologies really criminalize certain populations. I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about this approach and what you have found, particularly this idea of digital sovereignty, which is one of the things that you talk about? And I'm afraid I'm going to have to be a little bit of an aggressive timekeeper here to make sure we have everybody, but please share as much as you can with us. I really appreciate all the work that you do.
Sure, thanks so much. First, just want to say that I'm so honored to be here with so many luminaries and really excited to see what comes out of this conversation. For context, I'm a researcher with Community Justice Exchange. We work with over 90 different pretrial bond community bail and bond funds, as well as with the education system. And so we would get questions from different comrades saying, what's up with this ankle monitor? What's up with this kind of data collection? And it's kind of like a thread that you pull, and the more you pull the thread, the more you find it tangled up with everything. And so that's sort of the context for this talk that I'm about to present. So I'd love to start by sharing my favorite Ursula Le Guin quote, which is, to make a thief, make an owner, to create crime, create laws. So what I've been thinking a lot about is how to articulate prison abolitionist perspectives on data and criminalization. And that's because data as we know it has long been used as the primary weapon by the criminal legal system to justify the need for and legitimacy of the criminal legal system. The criminal legal system furnishes data as proof to blame individuals for their own punishment, all the while criminalizing only certain behaviors when performed by certain people, yet purporting to be not only objective, but just. Think of all of the places where walking in public is not illegal, but if you are profiled a certain way, a cop will stop you. Every time a cop stops you, that leads to a ticket or a court date or a jail stint or prison sentence. That creates data points that get recycled into a confusingly networked and patchy digital system. So the next time you're stopped, some or all of those previous police stops can weigh against you at every stage of the legal process. Now, it doesn't matter if 9 out of 10 of those tickets that you got were from stop and frisks that were later ruled unconstitutional.
Come on.
Your marijuana possession conviction may have already landed you in jail, or maybe led to a court-mandated drug class that perhaps you missed, which gave you a failure to appear on your record. It doesn't matter that pot is now legal where you live. All those charges and convictions from the 1990s still live on your record, even in some cases after you expunge them. And actually, some drop charges from the 1980s might also live on your record too. And they shouldn't be there, but you have no way to change or even know that. In any event, the cop who's stopping you pulls up your record electronically and decides that you're dangerous or vagrant. The risk assessment checklist used by pretrial services at the jail determines that you need to be locked up because you're high risk. And then the judge decides that you require paternalistic supervision even once you are released. So that's what we're calling data criminalization. And the problem here is a data criminalization. To wrangle up data criminalization, we've been looking back in time, beyond today's technologies and going back to the origins of the prison, the eugenic ideologies of racial purification, the corrective language of the asylum, to make sense of how technologies and big data analysis are operating today in the criminal punishment system. I've been inspired by the theorist Simone Brown, who wrote about surveillance and biometric technologies having a lineage not only in the panopticon, but roots in the transatlantic slave trade. And I've learned so much about market-driven data used for behavioral control from Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism. We understandably get so focused today on scary sounding technologies like black box prediction algorithms and facial recognition software. But really, any of the individual technologies that we encounter in the pretrial bail fund and immigration bond fund spaces, so GPS ankle monitors, location tracking, smart link algorithms that are used to determine pretrial conditions of release. These are all just reversion tools that deflect attention away from the racist data sets on which they rely, which catalog the results of the oldest machineries of criminalization in the US that are based on the vilest and simplest kinds of racism, xenophobia, and classism, barely disguised by the language of law. So we want to bring our attention back to that fundamental abolitionist understanding that we don't just want to tinker with the tools, we want to take the whole system apart. So we talk a lot about the data criminalization iceberg at CJE. It's been a useful analogy to think about the tips that we can see above the water. This would be, say, ankle shackles and maybe the SmartLink app, some of the higher profile police ICE collaborative programs like secure communities. But below the surface of the water, what we don't see is the vast infrastructural, interoperable, multiply networked, cloud-based data sharing computer systems that, for instance, automatically cross-check against DHS data sets all the fingerprints of every single foreign-born person who was booked by a cop to flag whether or not they're arrestable by ICE. I want to spend a minute on that point So here, the infrastructure of DHS databases reveal the actual system versus the range of rhetorical positions that are wielded by successive administrations. So all travel visa and naturalization data sets funnel biometrics to cross-check against criminalizing law enforcement data. That makes it so crystal clear that even though being foreign-born is not illegal, one's foreign birth absolutely marks a person for increased punishment, vulnerability to state violence, especially if there are intersecting forces such as anti-Blackness, Black economic privilege, or legal status added into that mix. It comes as no surprise that even one's perceived appearance of foreign birth creates the state violence. ICE's criminal alien program is infamous for encouraging jail staff to share with ICE lists of everyone who's booked who's also suspected of being foreign born. So that's where fancy digital racism meets old school analog racism. But what is fascinating about this moment in technology is that well beyond the reaches of the criminal punishment and immigration enforcement systems, the general public is increasingly subject to constant, ongoing, extremely invasive data gathering techniques from seemingly benign sources. Spotify, cell phone apps, parking meters, kiosks at airports, universities, and the post office all still offer incredibly personal data, such as eye movements and facial expressions captured while we scroll, or networks of personal and professional relationships, and of course, our real-time GPS locations. These data points are not just used for marketing, as though that would be permissible. They're used to predict behavior and change it, such as Cambridge Analytica's use of micro-targeting Americans on Facebook to change our political opinions. Similarly to how criminal laws are generally used only against individuals who are targeted by police as suspects, these ever-expanding digital data sets criminalize people unevenly based on their vulnerabilities to the market, white supremacy, and US state violence. So that brings up some really large, interesting questions for movements today. One of them is, given that data creation and collection is part of literally everything we do in life, what's our strategy for adapting abolition to that? Zuboff makes a convincing case that privacy laws, antitrust laws, laws in general, haven't been sufficient to protect us. I'd like to extend that analysis to the criminal punishment space. Laws are clearly not going to save us when laws themselves are the problem. And laws fail always to protect communities who are criminalized and are given legal rights. So given that criminal legal data is the literal, material, and figurative stuff that the criminal punishment system requires in order to justify punishment under the law, what could data sovereignty, true meaningful ownership of our lives and the data generated by our living, offer us as an abolitionist approach? That's what I'm hoping to hear out with you all.
Thanks so much, Puck, and for connecting a lot of dots and provoking a lot of thoughts for us about what does an abolitionist perspective look like when we're dealing with e-carceration, the surveillance state, whatever we want to call this, broad package of technologies that we're dealing with. So I'm going to hand over to Emmett now, and to wind us up with some presentations and discussion from people who are on the ground dealing with this technology. Emmett?
Thanks, James. So these reports are amazing. I guess we really want to look at how the local fights are going. So we're going to turn to Yvette Ale, who is the policy lead at Dignity and Power Now in Los Angeles and served as the coordinator of Justice LA, of the Justice LA Coalition. She also served as the statewide coordinator for Californians United for Responsible Budget, a statewide coalition of over 85 grassroots organizations, successfully shifting state and local spending from corrections and policing to human service. And we're also going to speak with Tierra Rainey, who is the executive director of the Tucson Second Chance Community Bail Fund. She's based in Pima County, where the rapid expansion of pretrial EM is currently being packaged as a bail reform by local law enforcement. So thank you both for being with us today. Yvette, there have been a number of legislative and as well as judicial decisions recently in California around pretrial. Can you highlight a few of the more impactful ones? And and just talk about how they sort of impact the landscape of EM, either in the state or the local level, and how folks are sort of responding there.
Yeah, thank you, Emmett, for that question. And thank you, James, Maisha, and the MediaJustice team for having me today. And as an organizer, I want to share my deep appreciation for Kate, Julie, and Puck's research that really arms those of us that are on the ground with tools that reflect back what we already know is true through our lived experiences, but those experiences are often dismissed by those in power. You know, California is a really great case study on how not to do pretrial reform. And it's really around pretrial reform that the conversation of the use and expansion of electronic monitoring here in California and Los Angeles, really, which is the largest, most populous county here in California, takes root. And the problem was really rooted in the framing of bail reform itself. It's not enough to end the use of money bail. Money bail is just one part of the problem. And the larger issue for those of us that are here on the ground is the use of pretrial incarceration, period. You know, we're talking about folks that are legally innocent, and by the California Constitution should be extended the presumption of innocence. And it was in this divergence that from the interpretation of money bail versus pretrial reform as a larger issue that led the state of California to pass Senate Bill 10, which was an incredibly harmful bill that ended money bail. Like, yay, we want to get rid of money bail. It's awful, it's exploitative, it's racist. It impacts Black and brown women disproportionately here in the state of California. Over 80% of money bails paid by Black and brown women. It's a gender justice issue. However, the alternative, or the presumed alternative to money bail, was the expansion of probation supervision, including electronic monitoring, the use of algorithmic-based risk assessment instruments, another example of technology being leveraged to actually facilitate the incarceration of our community members. The expansion of law enforcement. So probation is often seen as an alternative to incarceration itself, but it in fact is an extension of law enforcement. They're armed, they're tasked with supervising our community members and then funneling them back into the jail system. And it also expanded judicial discretion. And this is a really key piece because the judiciary here in California has been one of the biggest roadblocks to actually implementing real pretrial reform and decreasing our pretrial population here in California and in Los Angeles. So SB 10 passed through the state legislature. However, the money bail folks launched a referendum. So the bail industry pushed Prop 25, which would have stopped and should have stopped the implementation of Senate Bill 10. So we had the bail industry on one side, we had the neoliberal Democrats on the other that are still pro-law enforcement, that thought that the single issue policy victory of ending money bail was the goal, not reforming pretrial incarceration as a whole. And then there were us, the abolitionists, that were like, we don't buy either option. Neither is good. Neither is going to achieve decarceration. We understood that any form of surveillance was only going to maintain or increase the number of folks that are incarcerated pretrial. Our goal was to eliminate and is to eliminate the use of pretrial incarceration in all forms of incarceration, including electronic monitoring, with a very, very small amount of money that we were able to leverage to stop Prop 25. Not only were we able to defeat Prop 25, but we were able to shift the narratives around how pretrial reform was discussed. However, before California voters shot down Prop 25, the Judicial Council of California began implementing pilot programs for SB 10 across the state, including here in Los Angeles County. And so these pilot programs continue to be expanded despite the fact that California voters rejected Prop 25/SB 10. and are really pushing for more comprehensive pretrial reform. This past budget cycle here in California, the legislature actually rejected the Judicial Council's funding for expansion of these pretrial programs. Both the Senate and the Assembly rejected these dollars, but Governor Newsom came in through pressure from SEIU, which represents probation. He inserted $140 million to continue expanding the Judicial Council's pretrial pilots this past budget cycle. So what we're seeing is an entrenchment of electronic monitoring, risk assessments, expansion of probation supervision, even though the voters are actually more progressive and understand the nuances of what it really takes to implement real pretrial reform here. And one of the themes that I've been hearing in today's conversation is lack of transparency, lack of data around electronic monitoring. And this is an ongoing theme here in California as well. Luckily for us, we have great partners and comrades at UCLA Law, which have filed PRA requests. So we've been able to get little snapshots of the Judicial Council pretrial pilot over the last year. So here in Los Angeles, electronic monitoring is used for people placed on supervised release, and the data describing the use of EM is really alarming. Of individuals charged with felonies and placed on supervised release, 55% were placed on EM. And the failure to appear rate among those placed on EM was 3% higher than people on standard monitoring and 1% higher than individuals that were OR'd. And so we're seeing that the data doesn't reflect their arguments that EM actually increases the number of people that return to court. And for misdemeanors, these numbers are even more striking. For those charged with misdemeanors and placed on supervised release, 97% were placed on electronic monitoring. Those who were OR'd only failed to appear 5% of the time, whereas those on EM failed to appear 42% of the time. So there's no evidence to support the idea that electronic monitoring decreases the failure to appear rate. And in the case of the pretrial pilot in Los Angeles, electronic monitoring correlates with high failure to appear rates, particularly for misdemeanors. So these numbers are deeply concerning, as electronic monitoring is invasive, as we heard through the research, unnecessary, and it evidently does little to nothing to reduce failure to appear rates here in Los Angeles County. But this data is being kept very close to the vest by the Judicial Council. They're not disaggregating by race or gender, and the lack of transparency is really telling that their focus is really not to increase failure to appear rates, but rather to keep funneling our community members back into the system and to expedite that process. The Judicial Council is really focused on efficiency rather than justice. Here in Los Angeles County, we're also trying to implement a county-wide pretrial system. So in San Francisco, for example, there's an independent pretrial services entity. And we've really been pushing for that here in LA County. Just a few weeks ago, LA County passed a motion to start implementing that and created a work group that I'm a part of, and only 2 other community members are part of that body. And we're having to contend with the LA County Superior Court and probation in the room that are saying, yes, we want to release more folks pre-trial, but we only feel safe doing that with electronic monitoring. And the safety of the person actually being released is not even a factor in their decision making. So we have a really contentious battle on our hands. There have been some successful pretrial reforms, at least through the courts. And the primary court case has been the Humphrey case, which was litigated by one of our comrades, Alec Karakatsanis of Civil Rights Corps. And so what the case ultimately decided was that someone's ability to pay must be taken into account when setting money bail, which is a huge victory, right? Ability to pay should absolutely be taken into account. However, the decision failed to name what ability to pay looks like. What are the standards of ability to pay? And what we're seeing as Humphrey begins implementation in areas like San Francisco is that electronic monitoring has increased by 300%. 300%. Here in Los Angeles, we don't have transparency over that data, but through a PRA request, we got a snapshot into our future. So we saw that applications for the use of electronic monitoring increased by over 100%. So we know that LA County is already preparing itself to increase the use of electronic monitoring, but the data continues to be kept away from the community, from advocates, and from those that are most impacted by these systems. We also hear the argument that, EM is a cheaper alternative than incarceration. And here in LA County, we have the largest jail system in the world. So we know that this is incredibly costly to our community members, not just for taxpayers, but for those that are being funneled into the system, that are kept from their jobs and their families. And that cost is $18.5 million over 2 years to fund the Judicial Council's pilot program and expand electronic monitoring. This is a massive amount. And we're seeing the same in Sacramento, where Sacramento County is paying out $8.2 million over 2 years with a yearly continuation cost of $5 million. So we know this is very costly. We've been able to successfully at least push the conversation towards electronic monitoring being identified as the most restrictive condition of release. DA Gascon, at the beginning of his tenure, he released a policy platform that named electronic monitoring as the most restrictive condition, which was great that he at least named it. But the problem is that the district attorney's office continues to be on the attack by the DAs themselves that still pursue more punitive responses to harm, and by judges. The judiciary, like I mentioned earlier, continues to be a huge roadblock to actual implementation of comprehensive pretrial reform here in Los Angeles. So it's a continuous battle that we're fighting on the risk assessment front, on the electronic monitoring front. And because of COVID, we feel a lot of urgency. The county feels a lot of urgency to release folks pretrial. We're nearly 50% pretrial in the jail system in Los Angeles, but in the women's jail, it's 56% pretrial. And so we feel a lot of urgency. However, we are continuously having to push back against the same urgency that the county feels for releases and their proposed alternative solution of electronic monitoring.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's great to hear all this. People are actually pushing back and all that they're doing. And it's also kind of disconcerting to hear that that the people who are so invested in maintaining the status quo are willing to overlook the will of the people. We'll turn now to Tiara. Tiara, maybe we can just talk a bit about what's going on in Pima County. So as in a number of other places, the officials in Pima County are looking to end cash bond. Anytime we see a proposed solution to carceral injustice coming from those who benefit from preserving the carceral mechanism, it seems wise to be wary. Is this the case here, and particularly in the context of Pima County's history with you?
So thank you so much for having me here to talk about my small town in Arizona. But I think it's really important that when we have these conversations that we uplift communities that are not just in major cities, right? So Tucson is about an hour north of the US-Mexico border. And while we are in a hyper non-Black space, Black folks still exist. I'm a second generation Tucsonan. We are 5% of the population, and yet we make up 15% of those that are incarcerated in Pima County Jail. So obviously the same racist systemic issues persist here, the same as they do in any other major city. And in terms of bail reform, it's kind of surprising to hear about any place in Arizona having bail reform. And you would be right to be suspicious of that, specifically because of our Constitution. The only body that actually has the ability to abolish bail in our state is the legislature. However, we have a so-called progressive prosecutor who's cooperating with our newly elected sheriff who are saying that on the county level, they are going to abolish bail. And what does that actually mean for the folks here, right? What it means is that they are rolling out an electronic monitoring program to decarcerate, which is vague. There's also this acknowledgement that they don't actually have the power, and specifically the county attorney doesn't have the authority with which to end bail, right? Because it's ultimately up to the discretion of the judiciary, right? The magistrates and the judges set bail. At most, what she could do is have the prosecutors no longer ask for bail, but that's not the policy that she's implementing. She's saying that we won't ask for bail when people are low risk, but when people are high risk, we're asking for excessive bails. I can already tell you that excessive bail already exists. As a community bail fund, the average bail I would say that we get for a Black male presenting person is $10,000 or more. And that's the bails now, right? And so the bails are only going to increase with this concept of risk. And I think that that also brings up something else that's very inherent in this conversation, is that Arizona actually has a mandated risk assessment tool, the PSA. And it was mandated by our Supreme Court back in 2009. So this is already being this has already been integrated. Risk assessments have already been integrated into the pretrial assessment that have already been integrated into bail, right? Into how bail is being set for folks. And what we already know is that Black folks, BIPOC folks in general, Indigenous, brown folks are getting higher bonds through that system because who is high risk, right? Data is flawed. Data is flawed because people are flawed, right? The people that are analyzing these systems. So what does this mean in terms of our organizing? I think actually this conversation is really pertinent because I feel like so many great points have already been brought up regarding research and why these reports are so important, because the lack of transparency, I think, makes it very difficult to really understand what they're doing on the pretrial level here. Pima County is also a MacArthur grant recipient for safety and justice, which also means that there have been a plethora of decarceration efforts, and yet somehow the jail population only continues to grow, right? And so the lack of transparency means that on our end, we can be community actors, we can advocate for folks, we can post bond, which disrupts that cycle, right? But ultimately, if the bonds are all $25,000, $100,000, we will never have enough money to free our people. It ultimately comes down to making sure that the folks on the ground here, the directly impacted communities here, know that there are better options than just being rolled into EM because they're a Black, brown, and Indigenous person who happens to not have money, right? Like, I think also when we're talking about carceral actors co-opting the language of abolition, co-opting the language that has been, pushed out by revolutionary folks across this country and saying that they're ending cash bail, I think Yvette has already hit the nail on the head. That's never been our messaging. Our messaging isn't to end cash bail. Our messaging is to end the system of pretrial detention, right? And driving that point home is key. And I think also in disrupting their narrative, what we have to ask is, are your programs actually affecting the most directly impacted, right? The most marginalized within the system. I can already tell you now, I haven't seen the data because these programs are still relatively new. However, that would be something in terms of research that would be so helpful to our work in the future, is getting a FOIA, right? To know what the racial impact data is. But I can tell you, I'm assuming that most of the people who are being deflected out of the system altogether are probably white. I'm sure that the vast majority of people being enrolled in electronic monitoring or facing excessive bonds and are still in the jail are Black, brown, and Indigenous folks, right? So if you have bail reform that's supposed to decarcerate, but then really it means just more Black, brown, and Indigenous people end up staying inside, that's not bail reform, right? That's not actually decarcerating. I think ultimately as a movement, as abolitionists, I think folks try to be critical of us in the sense that they're like, what you want is unachievable. And that's not what we're saying here. We understand that there are compromises within that and reaching our ultimate vision of ending the system altogether. But there is a huge difference between saying you're doing bail reform that overwhelmingly does not benefit people in our community, right? That overwhelmingly is still going to stigmatize Black male presenting people in a state where there are very few people who look like us and advocate for us. So I think education, and I want to be clear, I don't think that that's necessarily what has to happen everywhere. I think in our very specific context, education is really key, political education in terms of understanding that ending money bail was not the ask, right? And I think, unfortunately, when you have really popular movements in other cities, it's easy for systems actors to cherry pick these phrases that sound progressive and transformative. And, you know, folks here don't know because Arizona's a little behind the times, I'm not gonna lie,
So,
right?
excuse me, Tiara, I know you're racing, but we're kind of getting close to end of
Fine.
time here. So if you
Yeah.
can wind up and speak a little slowly. Thanks so much. I'm really sorry to have to.
No, I
lose my
apologize.
voice.
I know I was actually probably going way too fast for the interpreters. I apologize. I knew that we were tight on time. So just keeping it short and sweet. That's essentially it. Thank you all so much. And again, the research, I think the future of the research is, again, getting those FOIA requests, helping us analyze what's happening in these systems, what's actually like who's being enrolled in these programs, because there's a complete lack of transparency. Folks like to say that they're abolishing cash bail, but then they don't like to show any data about what is or isn't happening within these cages. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for telling us what's going on there. And it is amazing to me how we manage to, how people try to co-opt the language and co-opt the movement to maintain the status quo. So thank you both for sharing your insights. We'll turn now to Myasia to close us out.
Yep, that is me. We're about to lose all of our support team and like right now. So I'm gonna speak slowly, but succinct. So could you move to the next slide, please? Essentially, MediaJustice is putting together a challenging e-carceration squad, which we're really excited about. We've tapped some of our allies, comrades who have expertise and research, legal expertise, digital organizing, and media to really support local groups fighting the expansion of electronic monitoring. So we're gonna drop a link in the chat, but don't worry, we're gonna follow up with an email that has video, that has the link to the form. If you're one of those groups or people or impacted folks who's involved in a struggle around electronic monitoring and could use some support around research, litigation, popular education, media support, etc. Please be on the lookout for the launch of our challenging e-carceration toolkit, which is going to be focused on how to fight electronic monitoring and cash bail campaigns. And then lastly, please join us again for our next MediaJustice campaign call that'll be happening on November 9th. This one will be focused on platform accountability and Facebook. So we're really excited for that conversation and we hope you all can join us. Thank you so much to all of our guest speakers. All of you have been incredible. Super appreciate all the work that you do, spending time with us on this call. We're just incredibly grateful. So thank you so much for joining us. And I know we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everyone.